On the morning of February 26, 2022, exactly 48 hours after Russian tanks rolled across the border into Ukraine, a group of policymakers in Washington and Brussels made a decision that would silently, but violently, fracture the foundation of the global economy. In a coordinated press conference, the United States and the European Union announced that they were deploying what financial experts called the nuclear option. They were cutting Russia off from SWIFT. To the average person watching the news, this sounded like just another bureaucratic sanction, a technicality, but to anyone who understood the plumbing of the global financial system, this was an earthquake. SWIFT is not just a messaging app, it is the nervous system of global capitalism. Connecting 11,000 banks across 200 countries, processing $5 trillion in transactions every single day. By severing this connection, the West wasn't just sanctioning a country, they were attempting to blind it, mute it, and paralyze it instantly. The intention was clear and publicly stated: cripple the Russian economy, cause the ruble to collapse into dust, and force a domestic revolution that would end the war. The French finance minister even explicitly said, "We will cause the collapse of the Russian economy." And for a few days, it seemed to work. The ruble crashed by 30%. Russian ATMs ran dry. Panic set in. But then, 2.5 years later, the dust settled, and the West was left staring at a reality that wasn't supposed to exist. Russia did not collapse. The ruble recovered. Russian factories kept running, and Russian oil kept flowing to new buyers in the East. But while the immediate target survived, something far more dangerous had occurred. The weapon itself had backfired. By unplugging a G20 nation from the global financial grid, the United States sent a terrifying signal to every other country on Earth. The global financial system is no longer a neutral public utility, it is a political weapon. And if you cross Washington, your access to your own money can be revoked overnight. This realization has triggered a silent panic across the global South. From Beijing to Brasilia, from Riyadh to New Delhi, we are now witnessing the beginning of a historic 5-stage pattern that has destroyed financial empires before. It happened to the British pound a century ago, and the data shows it is happening to the US dollar right now. To understand why this is happening, and why the timeline suggests the American financial empire has roughly 20 years left of dominance, we have to look beneath the surface of the headlines and understand the machinery of the trap the US has accidentally set for itself. But before we can understand the collapse, we have to understand the weapon. Most people think SWIFT is a bank that holds money. It isn't. SWIFT is actually a secure messaging protocol based in Belgium. Think of it like the Gmail of banking. When a bank in New York wants to send $1 million to a bank in Tokyo, they don't put cash on a plane. They send a secure message via SWIFT that says, "We are debiting our account and crediting yours." Without this message, the money doesn't move. The entire modern world relies on this trust. SWIFT was created in 1973 specifically to be a neutral, non-political utility to facilitate global trade. However, because the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, and because almost all international dollar transactions must ultimately be cleared through a bank in New York, the United States government holds a unique legal leverage over this system. They can effectively order SWIFT to disconnect a user, or else face sanctions themselves. The US has used this power before, most notably against Iran in 2012. That was a test case. It devastated the Iranian economy, contracting it by 9% and forcing them to the negotiating table. Washington looked at that success and assumed the same tactic would work against a superpower like Russia. But they made a fatal miscalculation. Russia is not Iran. Russia is the world's 11th largest economy, a critical supplier of energy, food, and fertilizer to the world. When you cut off a small country, you isolate them. But when you attempt to cut off a massive, resource-rich continent like Russia, you don't isolate them, you force them to build a new system. And that is exactly what has happened. This brings us to the historical precedent, because what we are watching isn't new. It has happened 4 times in the last 110 years. The most chilling parallel is what happened to Great Britain. In 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, London was the financial capital of the world. The British pound was what the dollar is today, as good as gold. But when war started, Britain made a desperate decision to weaponize its financial dominance. They passed the Trading with the Enemy Act and seized the assets of German banks and companies held in London. At the time, this seemed like a smart war tactic, but the unintended consequence was catastrophic for the British Empire. Neutral countries looked at London and realized their money wasn't safe there. If Britain could seize German money today, they could seize Spanish, or Swiss, or American money tomorrow. Slowly, silently, capital began to flee London. It moved to a neutral, rising power across the ocean, New York. It took 30 years, from 1914 to 1944, for the transition to complete. But the trigger was that initial decision to politicize the currency. The pattern is always the same. First, the dominant power controls the system. Second, they weaponize it to punish a rival. Third, the targets find alternatives. Fourth, neutral countries hedge their bets to avoid being next. And fifth, the original weapon loses its power. We saw this pattern repeat in 1979 during the Iranian hostage crisis. President Jimmy Carter froze $12 billion of Iranian assets. While justified by the hostage taking, it sent a shockwave through the Middle East. OPEC nations, who were sitting on mountains of petrodollars, suddenly realized their sovereign wealth was vulnerable to an American executive order. This was the moment the seeds of diversification were sown. It's why today, you see sovereign wealth funds buying real estate in London, gold in Switzerland, and businesses in Asia. Rather than keeping everything in U.S. treasuries, they learned that dollar reserves are technically essentially an IOU from the U.S. government. An IOU that can be cancelled if the political winds change. But the events of 2022 were the final straw. When the US and EU froze $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves, the illusion of safety was shattered forever. This was the specific moment the dollar ceased to be a neutral store of value. Imagine you are the leader of Saudi Arabia, or India, or Brazil. You might have good relations with the US today. But what if, in 5 years, you disagree with Washington on human rights, or climate policy, or a border dispute? Could your national savings be frozen? The answer, clearly now, is yes. This existential fear is driving the most rapid shift in the global financial order since World War II. Let's look at the hard data, because the numbers do not lie. Since the sanctions were imposed, the process of de-dollarization has accelerated at a stunning speed. In 2021, 87% of Russian trade was settled in US dollars or euros. Today, that number has collapsed to below 60%. The vacuum has been filled by the Chinese yuan and the Russian ruble. But it's not just Russia. China has developed its own version of SWIFT, called SIPS. In just 3 years, the volume on this alternative network has doubled, processing $27 trillion in 2023 alone. It acts as a backup generator for the global economy, a way to trade that bypasses American eyes and American sanctions. Even more telling is the behavior of the world's central banks. For decades, when a country made extra money from trade, they bought U.S. Treasury bonds. It was the standard, safe investment. But starting in 2022, that behavior stopped. Instead of buying American debt, central banks began buying gold at a rate we haven't seen since 1967. In 2022 and 2023, they bought over 1,000 tons of gold each year. Why gold? Because gold is physical. It has no counterparty risk. You can store it in your own vaults in Shanghai or Mumbai, and the United States cannot freeze it, sanction it, or delete it with a keystroke. This is a vote of no confidence in the fiat dollar system. We are also seeing the breakdown of the petrodollar system. The arrangement born in the 1970s where Saudi Arabia agreed to sell oil exclusively in US dollars. That monopoly is now effectively dead. Saudi Arabia has begun accepting Chinese yuan for oil. The UAE is settling oil trades with India in rupees and dirhams. When the commodity that powers the world is no longer priced exclusively in your currency, the structural demand for your currency begins to evaporate. This doesn't mean the dollar will disappear tomorrow. That's a Hollywood scenario. The reality is a slow, grinding erosion, a death by 1,000 cuts. So, what is the timeline for this decline? If we use the British pound as our guide, the transition from weaponization to Replacement takes about 2 to 3 decades. Britain weaponized the pound in 1914. The dollar took over in 1944. The US weaponized the dollar via SWIFT in 2022. That puts the potential end of absolute dollar hegemony somewhere around the late 2030s or early 2040s. However, we must factor in technology. Information moves faster today. Digital payment systems like China's CIPS or India's UPI can scale exponentially in a way that physical banking never could. This suggests the decline could happen even faster, perhaps in 15 to 20 years. The world that is emerging is multipolar. It won't be a world where the yuan simply replaces the dollar as the sole king. It will be a fragmented world. A dollar block for the West, a yuan block for the East, and a non-aligned block using gold and baskets of currencies. For the United States, the consequences of this shift will be profound and painful. For decades, America has enjoyed what economists call an exorbitant privilege. Because the world needs dollars, the US can print money to pay for its imports without causing immediate hyperinflation. It allows the US government to run massive deficits, funding a global military empire and domestic social programs simultaneously. But as the dollar's share of global reserves drops, from 71% in 1999 to 58% today, that privilege fades. When foreign nations stop buying US debt to fund their reserves, the US will have to offer higher interest rates to attract buyers. Higher interest rates mean the cost of servicing the national debt skyrockets. This leads to a vicious cycle: more printing, more inflation, and a lower standard of living for the American middle class. The cheap goods, cheap energy, and stable mortgages that Americans have taken for granted are all subsidized by the dollar's reserve status. Losing that status means America becomes a normal country, rich, yes, but constrained by reality, unable to spend beyond its means without consequence. The irony of this entire tragedy is that the United States defeated itself. China didn't need to destroy the dollar, Washington did it for them. By turning the global financial infrastructure into a battlefield, the US destroyed the trust that made the system work. They assumed that because there was no alternative to SWIFT, the world would have to obey. But they forgot the most basic rule of strategy: if you make a system intolerable for the participants, they will build a new system. Russia proved it was possible to survive outside the dollar. Now, the rest of the world is rushing through the door that Russia kicked open. In the end, historians will likely look back at February 26, 2022, not as a demonstration of American strength, but as the moment of American hubris. It was the day the West fired its financial nuclear weapon, only to realize too late that the fallout would poison its own soil. The pattern has completed its cycle. The weapon has been used. The defenses have been built. And the era of the undisputed king dollar is drawing to a close. We are now entering the post-dollar world, a world of fragmentation, volatility, and new powers rising from the ashes of the old order. The only question left is not if it will happen, but how chaotic the transition will be.